everybody, and welcome back to an Invisible Illness Awareness Project. This week I wanted to just talk briefly about my experience with fructose malabsorption. To be honest, with all of the other diagnoses that I have, that one has played a more minor role, and I was actually kind of diagnosed by accident. It had been nearly a year since I had begun going to specialists and having diagnostic tests run, but it took me quite a while to realize that whatever the problem was rooted in something in the gastrointestinal tract. I had an endoscopy done and they had taken biopsies, tested them for celiac, and said that because I didn't have celiac, there was no reason that I needed to avoid gluten or wheat or grains in general, which of course is not necessarily true because it is, like I said in the past, one of the main triggers for EOE and other types of disorders make you really sensitive to gluten. So it can be a huge relief to cut it out, but for some reason I had wheat and dairy in my mind, and I wanted to have those two tested. And basically they were saying that wheat had been done, and I said, so what about dairy? And they said, well, the way we test dairy is we do an H2 test, which is H2 for hydrogen, and they do these tests once every day, but they take several hours, and they only take one group of about 6 people per day, and they're fully booked all the way out, so it would take like 6 weeks to get it, basically. And they said that, well, you can try to come in the day of, and maybe you can get a spot if somebody doesn't show. And so the day I found out that the results for a histamine intolerance were in, I went to go pick them up, and I made sure to come early. The test was just starting, and I was like, can I get in on that? And they're like, yeah, we have 2 people who didn't show, so you can have one of their spots. And I got in, and then we started off with lactose, which is milk sugar, and so basically what happens is they give you a glass full of this like white powdered milk sugar mixed with water, and you drink it. They had one machine in the room to test us all. We each had our own mouthpiece, and we would attach our mouthpiece to the machine, breathe into it, and if it got above a certain level, then that meant that the sugar was still in our stomach and it wasn't being digested properly. Because it wasn't being digested properly, it was starting to ferment, and that fermentation process releases H2, or hydrogen. So that then turns into the bloating, burping, gas that we would experience as side effects. So we do that for 2 hours for lactose to give it time, because sometimes there's a delayed reaction. And I think we had like one person at the end whose levels really skyrocketed, and then they were out. And then we moved on to fructose. So we started over again with a glass of this clear white fruit sugar that we had to drink. And as I was drinking it, I was like, this tastes amazing. So I'm already sure that because I like it so much, it's going to react positively. At that point, I had already familiarized myself with histamine intolerance and realized that all of the foods that I really craved were out. And sure enough, maybe about 30 minutes later, my levels started to go up and up and up until it was sure that I had it and there was no need to continue testing. Yeah, so then they sent me out to have a chat with the doctor, who gave me this info booklet about what I could and couldn't eat and what my life with that diagnosis would be like. And then the third part of the test was glucose, but they were saying that they couldn't test that on the same day because the other sugars would interfere with it or something. The interesting thing I did find out about fructose is that glucose sort of cancels it out. And we're looking at this chart of how much fructose and how much glucose something contains. If the levels are the same, then you basically consider it neutralized. And then when you're looking at how much fructose you can tolerate, basically a normal person can handle 25 to 50 grams per sitting. And if you can handle less than that, then you have malabsorption. So it could still vary from person to person how much you can tolerate, because somebody can tolerate 20 grams and somebody can only tolerate 5. And then you have to look very precisely at what you're eating. And then I think what you could do sometimes is, if you want to eat something that's higher in fructose, then you can take something else that's higher in glucose to balance them out if you eat them at the same time. But other than that, there's not really, there's not like a pill or anything you can take for it the same way you could for lactose intolerance. One thing that's slightly confusing is that because of lactose intolerance and then fructose malabsorption, sometimes people are tempted to say fructose intolerance. Fructose intolerance is actually a genetic disorder that you're born with, and that means you can't tolerate any amount of fructose at all. So I don't know anyone who has it, but I imagine that you would know from a very early age that you have it, and it would be very obvious, and you would have to be very vigilant about it. Another thing I realized after taking this test was that even though lactose itself wasn't a problem, I still couldn't tolerate milk. But that also explained to me why lactose-free milk wasn't the solution. I would still have a problem with lactose-free milk because it wasn't lactose that was the problem. It's either the whey or casein protein in the milk, which is in all milk products. It didn't really matter if I switched to like goat's milk or sheep milk. I would still experience the same reaction. So initially, once I had my list for fructose malabsorption, histamine intolerance, and EOE, I was really vigilant in combining all three and really paying attention to everything for quite a while, trying to figure out what was causing me this fatigue and try to get back to normal life as soon as possible. I did realize from the support group that a lot of people who have this don't have any other health problems, it seems like. For them, that's pretty much it, and other than their diet, they do lead very normal lives where they can go out and play and have a lot of energy. And that is also true for a lot of people with EOE, even though there are people with EOE who suffer from fatigue and are limited in other areas too. But I didn't really come across anyone that suffers from fructose malabsorption who also suffers from fatigue unless they happen to have other health problems. And those people were really rare in that group. So I guess it's fair to say that the comorbidity rate with that one is not very high. Eventually, my diet was so restricted that I just kind of ignored it. And I did mention at one point that I feel better when I don't even eat any grains at all. And grains are carbohydrates, which are complex sugars. So in my case, I could have more of an issue with sugar than just fructose. But there really were times where I questioned if the diagnosis was even accurate. I did once read somewhere that it could just be IBS, which is irritable bowel syndrome, where that could cause you to react to something, and maybe that's not the issue. So I was kind of hoping that at some point everything would heal and I would get my life back on track and I could retake that test in the future and it would test negative. But what sort of solidified that in my mind was that at one point when I had this juice machine and I was making fresh pressed juice, every day, and mostly drinking carrot juice, which, carrots are not an issue at all with fructose. But then at one point I had a few apples there, and instead of mixing in the apples with the others, I decided to just do pure apple juice, and I had like half a liter pitcher of fresh pressed apple juice, and it tasted amazing. So I pretty much just chugged it right away. And I mean, fresh pressed juice in general tastes amazing, which is why I go crazy over the carrot juice, even though I'm not really big on eating carrots. But in this case with the apple juice, right after I finished it, it was like I had gotten punched in the stomach, like it hurt. So apples, I think, have like a 3-to-1 ratio of fructose to glucose. So that was one of those where you do have to be careful, and that reaction kind of told me like, okay, so maybe this is a thing, even though I don't have to pay attention to it on a regular basis because my diet is so limited, I'm not going to go past that limit anyway. I do have to be careful in situations where it's going to be a lot. So, yeah. Yeah, but that's it. So I will see you guys next week.